Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper. Today I'd like to tell you something about Paolo Veronese and his amazing painting, The Wedding Feast at Cana, which I often call the most ignored painting in the world. It's in the Louvre today, and there you can easily see it if you know where to look. But before I do, if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel by clicking the button below. And let me get started. I call this, as I said, the most ignored painting in the world because it's an enormous painting. It's almost 10 meters wide, and everybody tends to miss it in the Louvre, even though millions of people walk by it every year. The reason for that is that it's placed behind the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa, of course, the most famous painting they have, is on a sort of small wall, and there you have to walk by it, and then you see this enormous painting, for which they have made a sort of a partition wall that stands in front of a doorway behind it, and that's a shortcut to several restaurants and restrooms, and so lots of people pass it, but most people miss it anyway. So for your next visit to the Louvre, I'm going to show it to you and explain a little bit about it. Now, I'm going to place myself in the corner so I don't obscure the painting. Now you see this thing, it's actually enormous. As I said, about 10 meters wide, and so very high as well. And it was made in 1563 for a monastery, a refectory of a monastery in Venice, for the Church of San Giorgio, of course, Maggiore, which is also an island. Saint George, of course, the one of the patron saints of Venice, and that had just started to be rebuilt by Palladio. You see this church here. The church itself hadn't been rebuilt yet, but at the time they just refurnished and rebuilt the refectory, the dining room of the monastery, and the architecture you see in the painting was supposed to be a continuation of the architecture of the room, so it must have been pretty lavish. The fact that it's now in the Louvre, by the way, is still a bit contested because it was stolen by Napoleon, brought to the Louvre, and after the decline of Napoleon, there were negotiations to return stolen art, and in the Louvre they claimed that it could not be moved anymore because it was in bad condition, and therefore offered some other paintings to return. It's not in that bad condition, really, so, well, that's something for the French and the Italians to worry about. For refectory, for these dining rooms, you have several paintings that were, or subjects that were suitable to be painted. Of course, the Last Supper is one of the more usual ones, and this is the wedding feast at Cana, which is a story told in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 2, and in it's the first miracle of Jesus. Jesus is sitting in the middle. I'll zoom in a second. Wait, we might just do that here. He sits in the middle, and according to the story, what happens is his mother notices that there's no more wine. The wine they've run out of wine, and she tells him that, and he responds by saying, "Oh, woman, what has this to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Oddly, in the entire Gospel of John, she's not called Mary. She's called his mother. Now, here in this painting, they've taken the main the center stage, which of course is because, well, Jesus and Mary. This is what the story is about. The groom and the bride have retired all the way to the left of the painting. We'll get back to them in a minute. Now, after he's been convinced that he has to do something about the wine situation, he tells the steward that he has to put water into stone vessels. That's what they've done here on the right. And you can see, and we've zoomed in a little bit to the right, they're stone vessels. They're quite elaborate. They've been decorated a lot. And you can see these stone vessels, and they're pouring out wine from it. And there's a man right next to them in this sort of white suit he's wearing. He's testing the wine. He's Pietro Aretino. It's a portrait of a famous Venetian at the time. He was a poet. Now the whole thing is filled with portraits. There are portraits of lots and lots of different people, well-to-do Venetians, important Venetians, but also the rich and famous of the world, and some of them weren't even alive at the time. Apparently there's a portrait of Charles V, Emperor Charles V in there. They always say that. I've never found him, I have to admit. But if there is, if you can find it, he'd been dead for about a decade when this was made. But what they're doing is they're making wine, and in the biblical story, they say that the steward then offers wine to his master, to the groom, the head of the household, and you can see everyone here is already sort of watching all this action with the wine, and they're curious about where this wine has come from. But on the other side of the painting, on the left side, you can see a man in green here in the middle, and that man in green is the steward. He's the guy who's in charge of the wine, and he tells his boss, the groom, the man in red and with the blue sleeves, sitting on the corner of the table. He's offered a glass of wine, and the boss, the groom, he then remarks that he has broken with the custom of serving the good wine first, well, in this case, apparently the good wine has come at the end. That, of course, tells us that Jesus's wine is better than the wine he'd served originally, because, of course, you would serve your expensive good wine first, and when people are all drunk, you can give them whatever. But in this case, he remarks that this wine is better than what they had before. You can there's let me get back to some of the portraits that are in there. Do you see the man in yellow sitting just behind you have the groom in red and blue, and then next to him is presumably his bride. Then a man in blue that I don't know who he is, and a woman that's very curious and looking over the shoulder of her husband at what's happening with this wine. And then there's a man in yellow, sitting there prominently with a stern look on his face. In many references, they always say that this is a portrait of Suleiman the Great, Sultan of Turkey, who had died by that time. And well, I can tell you for sure he's not, because he's dressed like a doge. The doges, the leaders of Venice, they were elected and elected for life. And it's the suit he wears. He has a suit on, the hat, there's this sort of strange cap that doges wore, and he has this yellowish suit on with the big buttons. Now, he could be one of many. The doge at the time when this was painted was called Girolamo Prioli. You see him up closer. Look at the woman next to him, just discreetly trying to clean her teeth with a toothpick. But that was this guy. This is Girolamo Prioli. He was the doge at the time when this was painted. Could be him. He looks something like this guy as well, and this is Andrea Gritti. He was a doge before. Really, I don't know which one it is. The one on the left right now was painted by Tintoretto. The one on the right by Titian. Both famous painters of Venice. But he's clearly wearing a doge's suit, and he's there as one of the prime guests, I suppose, sitting very close to the groom. Now that we're zoomed in so much, you can also see what they're eating. They're eating mostly fruit, and that's for good reason. It's time for dessert. Obviously, they've run out of wine. It's the end of dinner. You couldn't have a host that has only wine for the first course, right? And so they're having dessert, and that is strange when you look a bit higher in the painting, because there you see lots of people, cooks, carving up meat, and right above Jesus you can see what they're carving up. They're actually carving a lamb, and that is kind of out of place because, well, they're having dessert while you're still cutting up a lamb. And it's probably a reference to Jesus being the Lamb of God, the sacrificial lamb. Now, I've told you about the many portraits that are in there. I'm going to show you some of them. See, here in the middle, just before Jesus, in front of Jesus, there's a band, which you might have at a wedding feast. Now, they're not just any old people. This is a bunch of painters. The man in white with this sort of violin that he holds as a guitar. It's a viola da braccio, a big sort of violin, and that's actually a self-portrait of Paolo Veronese. Right behind him, the man who looks like he's shouting in his ear, he's also playing a viola da braccio. That's Tintoretto, another one of the famous painters of Venice. The other, there's a guy playing a flute, it's Jacopo Bassano. But the man in red with looks like he's playing a bass, it's called a violone. That's the sort of Nestor of the Venetian school of painters. He was by far the most famous of all of them and had a reputation that went far, far beyond Venice at the time. And he's called Titian. And it's sort of nice to have a group of painters who were not the most prominent people in the city, but that he added them all together. He took the foremost painters of Venice, and he sort of hidden them in plain sight by giving them something to do, which is, of course, play some music. Now, next time you're in the Louvre, go to the room where the Mona Lisa is. Have a look at the Mona Lisa if you want to, but walk behind her and you can see this amazing painting. And one of the fun things is that of these three painters that I've mentioned, Veronese, Tintoretto, and Titian, there's also always several of their paintings in that same room, so you can check them out as well. So off to the Louvre you go, and hope you enjoyed it. Remember, subscribe to my channel. Just click the button and maybe even tick the little bell next to it, so you'll be notified anytime I will upload another video. Bye for now.